Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Masih Kam.
Hakam.
Christ is risen.
Truly risen.
Christos Anesti. Why is this day different from any other days? This is actually an important question, and it was a question that the youngest child in the room would ask his entire family during the Passover meal. The reason the youngest person would ask this question was because children reflect both innocence and confusion at the same time. There is something different about this morning. So let us ask ourselves, what is different and why we are particularly here this morning? That's the confusion. The innocence is the fact that something great can happen this morning that can just escape us. Many things happen like that in life and in the world that escape us. We're so busy to look at the things that really marvel us and can marvel us. So today, as we celebrate the resurrection of Christ, we too ask a similar question: why is this day different than any other days? And in addition to the answer that was answered at the time of the Jewish Passover, because this was the day that we were passed over from death to life, today, of course, we celebrate the resurrection of Christ. But what does that mean for us, the resurrection of Christ? The resurrection is not simply an isolated event that took place somewhere in Jerusalem. It's something that affects our day-to-day life. In fact, that's why we read from the Gospel of John today, because the Bible reminds us always to see the entire plan of salvation, the entire story of what God has done for us as one story. Not just the resurrection, but John takes us back to the beginning. John purposely starts his gospel, in the beginning was the Word. He uses the exact same words that the author of the book of Genesis uses. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And why does he make this connection? What is the Word that became flesh? It is the same Word that created the world. That's why we read in the book of Genesis, God said, and it was. God does not have a past, a present, or a future. God is in the eternal now. Whatever God says happens. God said in the Old Testament, creation, and creation happened. And that same God who created the world decided to become flesh for us. That is why this morning is so special for us. If you study the religion or sociology of religion, you realize that many religions are similar. There are similarities in every religion. And sometimes people take that a step further and they say, well, all religions are the same. But actually they're not, to be quite honest, they're not. Many religions speak of a power, a force. Some even worship nature. Some offer sacrifices to nature. If you look at the ancient Aztec religion, they worship the sun and the moon. And they believe that in order for the sun and the moon to get up every day, they have to offer human sacrifices to the sun and the moon. Why? Because they were an agricultural civilization, as many societies are. And if their sun did not get up in the morning, their entire lifestyle would fall apart. They believed in a higher power. They weren't quite sure what that higher power is. And they figured, let's offer some sacrifices for that higher power to make sure that he shows up or she shows up every morning. Many religions have a sense of that higher power. In fact, perhaps a new religion in today's world that doesn't have a name is spirituality. A lot of people say today, we are spiritual, but we are not religious. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean a whole lot other than you're feeling a little special. And without being condescending, you can feel a little special by having an extra cup of coffee. You can feel very spiritual by having a drink. In fact, I joked around with somebody who has a liquor store. I said, you should be my spiritual advisor. You can be very spiritual in many ways, but it's very important to be specific in what you're spiritual about. And that is what's special about this morning, is that we are celebrating the fact that the same God who created the heavens and the earth didn't just send messengers, didn't just send prophets, didn't just do kind of nice things like make sure that the flowers bloom, but this same God became flesh. This is what is different about Christianity. We are not just one of many religions, and all religions are equal. Every religion tries to find God in different ways, in power and forces and wind. But what is unique about our faith is that God has been trying to find us from the beginning of time. Right back to the book of Genesis, we see how God is trying to find humanity. God is trying to find us. And God's love for us was so great that it wasn't enough for him to try to find us in abstract ways that we may miss, but God decided to become flesh. In addition to that, God always outdoes himself. That's why it's important to stay awake and be alert and ask ourselves, why is this day different? God lived among us. He showed us that forgiveness is possible. He showed us that healing is possible. Not only physical, but spiritual healing. He showed us that a renewal of body and soul are possible. And then he showed us what true love is. True love is giving yourselves for the other. He sacrificed his life for us. He reconciled us to heaven as promised throughout the Old Testament. This is the kind of God that we seek. Not a generic God, not a God of power, of forces, or of simply good feelings, but a God who has done something very concrete for us and asks for us to respond to his concrete call. That is why, towards the end of the Gospel of John, the women who went to the tomb heard something from Jesus. Jesus said, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom do you seek?" He said this to Mary Magdalene. And this word, "whom do you seek?" is a common thread throughout the entire Gospels. Right from the beginning, John chapter 1. The two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. And Jesus turned and saw them following, and he said to them, "What do you seek?" Same question is asked for us this morning. What do you seek? It's very important for us to have specific goals in our spiritual life. Otherwise, we're just wandering. Otherwise, we never really get a chance to grasp everything that God has done for us. The spiritual life is not easy. But in fact, every single saint, everyone who has ever lived, everyone who's tried to live their faith realizes that the spiritual life is not easy. So if you are having difficulties in your prayer life, if you are having difficulties coming to church, if you are having difficulties reading the Bible, it's no secret that you're not alone. You're not alone. Every single person who has tried to live this journey is not alone. Trying to find things is difficult. I don't know if you've ever asked directions in the Middle East. If you ask for the store that sells gum, they'll tell you, go down this street, the third tree on the right, there are two guys playing backgammon. One guy is wearing a red hat, and when you see him, you take 5 steps, and Abu Salim is right there, and he'll sell you some gum. So you figure, pretty simple, pretty straightforward, I got that. So you walk down the street, and you're counting 1 tree, 2 trees. Where's the 3rd tree? And then you end up in the next village. And then they send you back, and they said, I heard it was 3 trees. They said, yeah, they chopped down the 2nd tree. So go back. And then you get back, and there's 2 guys, but they're not playing backgammon, they're playing cards. And one guy, he doesn't have a red hat, he has a green hat. He happened to have lost his red hat that morning. Those are directions to finding some gum. Imagine how hard it is to find God. who's asking us, who do you seek? But if you are very clear in knowing what you are seeking, then you will find it. Eventually you will find your gum. That's a very similar analogy in our spiritual life. We will find the risen Lord if we keep asking ourselves and knowing, what do we seek and who do we seek? We have many examples in the entire Bible of holy men and women who have tried to see God and have been broken characters. I'll focus on two in the New Testament, Peter and Judas. Both were called by God. Both had a very special mission given to them by Jesus to be his followers. Judas betrayed Jesus, as you know, and Peter said to Jesus, though they all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away. But Jesus said to him, truly I say to you, this very night before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And so said all the disciples. What was the difference between Peter and Judas? Judas completely despaired for what he did. But yet Peter became humble and depended more and more on God. He followed Christ. He followed Christ to the cross. He followed Christ to the tomb. He accepted the resurrection and that the resurrection could change his life. Judas said, what have I done? But Peter said, what can you do to me? Not the other way around. Not what did I do to you, but what can you do to me? This is the call of all of us as disciples as we seek. Have very specific plans of what you are seeking in your spiritual life. Because without those very specific plans, we are just going right and left or just hanging around. Think of another analogy. If you're in a canoe on a river, and if you don't have a specific direction and are neither going right, nor left, nor forward, nor back, the river will take you in a direction you don't want to go. What are the only things in the river that are going with the flow? Dead animals and dead trees. Unfortunately, a lot of people live their spiritual life in the same way. They wake up and they expect God to show up. If they have a job interview, they double up on their prayers. If they're going to the hospital, say 3 extra rosaries, light 5 extra candles. All those are good. We need to pray. But prayer is not a superstition to make sure that God does everything we want. Prayer is, first of all, a complete reliance and dependence on God. And secondly, prayer helps us to realize that regardless of what happens in our life, God is with us. That is what we seek. On this morning, when we remember the resurrection of Christ, not only as something that happened in the past, but as something that is happening in our day-to-day life, God is asking us that question, what do you seek? And also He's asking us, why is this day different than any other day? If we don't do anything different, if we don't change anything in our life, then it is not different than any other day, and the resurrection of Christ has no meaning. Our faith is a very practical faith. It's a faith of God's love for us, but it's also a faith that reminds us that we give our life for others, and we give our life to God in service of others, and rejoicing that Christ is risen.
Truly.
Al-Masih kam.
Hakam kam.
Christos anesti.
Christos anesti.